It's the most important decision you're ever going to make in your life. It's new camera time, and you want to know whether you go full frame or crop sensor. There's a lot to take in here, so get your notepads out and we're going to jump right in. For those of you who aren't sure what full frame or crop sensor is, let me explain. So a full frame sensor is 36mm by 24, which is the same size as a single frame of 35mm film. An aps-c sensor is slightly smaller at 23.6mm by 15.6, and a micro four thirds sensor is 17.3 by 13mm. So what does this really mean? It means that an aps-c camera has a crop factor of 1.5 or 1.6 if you're shooting on a Canon aps-c camera, and a micro four thirds camera has a 2x crop factor. So when you're using an aps-c camera with a 50mm lens, you're really looking at a lens with a 75mm full frame equivalent or an 80mm on a Canon aps-c. And on a micro four thirds camera, you have 100mm with a 50mm lens. And it's not only the focal length that you have to take into consideration with the crop factor. To achieve the same depth of field as a full frame camera, you need to times the aperture of your lens by the same crop factor. So now that we're outside, I want to give a quick example of how the crop factor affects the aperture and the depth of field. So we have a full frame camera here. It's a Sony a7R5. We're at f4, 1/250 at ISO 320. So I take a picture of Jorge. You can see that the background is completely blown out and it's completely separated Jorge from the background, gives a nice blurry bokeh. And now if we compare that to pictures with the X-T5 and the GH5, you can see that the background isn't as blurry and the shallow depth of field isn't quite there. So how do we address this? Well, right now I've got the GH5, which is a micro four thirds camera, which has a crop factor of 2. To get the same shallow depth of field as the full frame camera, I'll need to divide the aperture by the crop factor. So nice and easy. The aperture of 4 divided by the crop factor of 2, we've got to drop this down to an f2. Nice and simple. So I take a picture of Jorge now, and now you can see that compared to the full frame camera, we have the same sort of shallow depth of field, and it looks great. And the same goes for the X-T5. We do 4 divided by the crop factor, which is 1.5, and that's around 2.7, 2.66. So we'll go to 2.8. We'll adjust some of the settings so our exposure's right. There we go. And then compare this to the full frame image, and the background is pretty much the same, and it looks great. So you can still achieve the same depth of field as a full frame camera. You just have to take the crop factor into consideration and do some math and open your aperture up. So I hope this kind of demonstration helps, and back to me in the studio, and I've always wanted to say that. So now you know the differences between full frame, aps-c, and micro four thirds. Let's talk about the pros and cons of each system. Typically, full frame cameras offer the best image quality. This is due to the large sensor size being able to gather more information for each picture, contributing to the overall sharpness and quality of the image. Another difference between the 3 sensor sizes is dynamic range. So if we take a camera from each system, a full frame, an aps-c, and a micro four thirds, and we have the same megapixel count, and we have all the same settings, the dynamic range on the full frame camera will be the best because each pixel will be larger and be able to take in more light and more information. This is also true for low light performance. For example, the Sony a7S III is famous for its low light capabilities. This is because it has a full frame sensor with only 12 megapixels. So each pixel is massive compared to, say, this micro four thirds camera here. So there's so much light and information being brought into each pixel that in low light situations, it will never let you down. However, the benefit of having a crop sensor camera is having the extra reach of focal length when you shoot in sport or wildlife and you can't get close to the subject. So for example, with the micro four thirds camera, using a 35 to 100mm is a full frame equivalent of a 70 to 200. So you have a lot more reach in a lot shorter focal range with a micro four thirds camera. So this is why wildlife photographers might use these kind of cameras, because you get a lot more reach. Apart from wildlife and sport, are there any other shooting situations that you can think extra reach is an advantage? Let me know in the comments. One of the main things that people look at when they're buying a new camera is their budget. So aps-c and micro four thirds cameras tend to be more affordable. This is just because it's a smaller sensor, so there's less technology being put into these cameras, allowing camera prices to drop down. This is what makes aps-c and micro four thirds cameras so popular with hobbyists, because some people aren't looking for flagship cameras like the R5. They don't need that pro level camera, body, and glass. So this is why these are great options for hobbyists. This is also the case with crop sensor lenses. They're a lot more affordable than their full frame equivalent, allowing people to expand their lens range at a more affordable price point. That's not to say there isn't more affordable options in the full frame system. Thanks to the technological advances to full-frame systems in their flagships, the entry-level systems are now becoming really cheap and packed with some amazing features at such a low price point. I know this was a lot of information to take in, but hopefully this has given you enough information about which camera and sensor size is right for you. So which one has piqued your interest? Let me know in the comments below.